The blood-stained auction poster fluttered in the wind as Willa Abernathy stood trembling on the makeshift platform, her wrists bound and her spirit nearly broken. It was 1877 in Central City, Colorado, and she had never imagined her life would lead to this moment being sold to the highest bidder like cattle at market. $500, called out a gruff voice from the back of the crowd. Willa's stomach turned to ice as she spotted the source, Silas Blackburn, a man whose reputation for cruelty preceded him. His hands were stained with the blood of countless men, and rumors abounded that 3 wives had already mysteriously perished under his care. His cold, calculating eyes assessed her as one might examine a horse checking for flaws, for usefulness. 550, another voice called, but Willa barely registered it. All she could see was Blackburn's satisfied smirk as he countered with $600. The auctioneer's voice rose with excitement. $600 for the young lady. Do I hear $650? Silence fell across the gathered crowd. Willa's father had gambled away everything they owned, including their small ranch outside of town. When he couldn't pay his debts, the creditors had taken everything including her. Her father had fled in the night, leaving her to face this horror alone, going once. The auctioneer called, his voice echoing across the town square, going twice. Willa closed her eyes, unable to bear watching Blackburn's triumphant expression. $700, a new voice called, calm and steady. Willa's eyes snapped open. Standing at the edge of the crowd was a tall stranger, his features partially obscured by the shadow of his hat. Unlike the other men gathered, he stood straight-backed, one hand resting casually on his holster. $750, Blackburn countered, his face reddening with annoyance. $1,000, the stranger replied without hesitation. A murmur rippled through the crowd. It was an extraordinary sum. Blackburn spat on the ground. $1,200. $1,500, the stranger said, stepping forward into the light. Willa caught her breath. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 25 or 26, with intense blue eyes that reminded her of summer skies. A faded scar ran along his jawline, and his clothes, while dusty from the trail, were of good quality. Blackburn's face contorted with fury. "You're pushing your luck, boy." The stranger merely shrugged, his hand still hovering near his gun. $2,000, he said, his gaze never leaving Willa's face. The crowd fell silent. Even Blackburn seemed stunned. $2,000, the auctioneer repeated, his voice tinged with disbelief. Going once, going twice, sold to the gentleman in the back. Relief washed over Willa, quickly followed by a new fear. Who was this man, and what did he want with her? The stranger approached the platform, paid the auctioneer, and was handed the paper that effectively transferred ownership of Willa to him. He tore it in half immediately, then climbed the steps to stand before her. "Isaac Thornton," he said quietly, his voice for her ears alone as he untied her bonds, "and you're not property to be bought and sold." Blackburn pushed his way to the front of the dispersing crowd. "I ain't finished with this yet, Thornton." Isaac turned slowly, positioning himself between Willa and the angry man. "I believe the auction is concluded." "You think I don't recognize you?" Blackburn sneered. "The famous bounty hunter. What do you want with a woman like her?" "Planning to collect on her father's bounty too?" "Step aside, Blackburn," Isaac said, his voice dangerously soft. "She's not worth $2,000, Blackburn continued, his hand inching toward his gun. "Unless you know something I don't." In a flash too quick for Willa to follow, Isaac's gun was drawn and pointed directly at Blackburn's chest. "You're right about one thing," Isaac said. "I am a bounty hunter, and I know exactly how many men you've killed. The law may not have caught up with you yet, but it will." His eyes narrowed. "Now step aside or give me an excuse to collect on you early." Blackburn's face paled, but he maintained his sneer as he backed away. "This ain't over, Thornton." Isaac holstered his gun and turned back to Willa, offering his arm. "Miss Abernathy, I believe you've had enough excitement for one day. You're coming with me instead." Willa hesitated. "How do you know my name?" "I've been tracking your father for 3 weeks, he replied honestly. "Gerald Abernathy is wanted in 4 territories for fraud and theft. I didn't know he had a daughter until I arrived in town yesterday." "And now you own me," she said bitterly. Isaac shook his head. No, madam, I don't. That paper was worthless the moment I tore it up. You're free to go wherever you please. Willa looked around the town square, acutely aware of the stares directed her way. Her home was gone. Her father had abandoned her. She had nowhere to go and no money to her name. And where would that be, Mr. Thornton? Something in Isaac's expression softened. For now, how about we get you a proper meal and discuss your options? I have a room at the hotel and I can arrange separate accommodations for you. Willa squared her shoulders. Why did you do it? Spend so much money on a stranger? Isaac's gaze shifted to Blackburn's retreating form. Let's just say I've seen what happens to women who fall into Blackburn's hands. No one deserves that fate. Without better options, Willa took his offered arm. Then I suppose I should thank you, Mr. Thornton. Isaac, he corrected her gently, and don't thank me yet. Blackburn isn't a man who gives up easily. As they walked away from the auction platform, Willa could feel Blackburn's eyes burning into her back. She'd escaped one danger only to find herself in the midst of another, caught between a ruthless killer and a mysterious bounty hunter who seemed determined to find her father. What she didn't know then was that this day would change the course of her life forever. The Gibson Hotel was the finest establishment in Central City, though that wasn't saying much. It stood 3 stories tall at the corner of Main Street, its wooden facade recently painted to mask its age. Inside, the lobby featured worn but clean furnishings, the smell of pine-scented soap barely masking the lingering odors of tobacco and whiskey. Isaac led Willa to a small table in the corner of the attached dining room, pulling out a chair for her before taking his own seat. A middle-aged waitress approached, her eyebrows rising slightly at the sight of Willa's disheveled appearance. "Coffee and 2 plates of whatever's hot," Isaac instructed, placing a coin on the table. The waitress nodded and disappeared toward the kitchen. "I don't have money to repay you," Willa said once they were alone. "For the meal or the other matter." "I'm not expecting repayment," Isaac replied. He removed his hat, revealing thick dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. Without the shadow of his hat brim, his features were more visible: strong jawline, straight nose, and those startlingly blue eyes that seemed to see right through her. "Then what do you expect?" Willa asked bluntly. "Information," he answered just as directly. "About your father." Willa's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "What makes you think I know anything? Most daughters know something about their fathers, even the ones who abandoned them." There was something in his tone, not judgment, but perhaps understanding. The waitress returned with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. Willa wrapped her hands around hers, grateful for the warmth. She hadn't realized how cold she felt until that moment. "My father." She began, then stopped. Where did one begin when describing Gerald Abernathy? He was charming. Everyone loved him when we first arrived in town 2 years ago. He could talk his way into or out of anything. And the gambling started small, a game here and there, then more, larger stakes. She took a sip of coffee, welcoming the bitter burn. "After my mother died last winter, he got worse. Said he had a system that couldn't fail." "They all say that," Isaac commented. "Yes, well, his system failed spectacularly. He borrowed money from anyone who would lend it, promised investments with incredible returns." She looked away. "I didn't know he'd put up our ranch as collateral until the bank came to take it 3 days ago. And that's when he ran." Willa nodded, the shame of it burning in her chest. "He said he was going into town to sort things out. He never came back." Her voice hardened. "The next day the creditors came for me, said my father had offered me as additional collateral." Isaac's expression darkened. "That's not legal." "Apparently it is when the judge owes the bank money too." She met his gaze squarely. "So there you have it." "I don't know where he went, Mr. Thornton. If I did, I might go there myself to give him a piece of my mind." The waitress returned with 2 plates of beef stew and cornbread. Willa hadn't realized how hungry she was until the food was before her. She ate carefully, trying to maintain some dignity despite wanting to devour everything in sight. "When was the last time you ate?" Isaac asked quietly. "Yesterday morning," she admitted. They didn't see much point in feeding merchandise. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing, allowing her to eat in peace. When she'd finished, he pushed his half-eaten cornbread toward her. She hesitated only briefly before accepting it. "I have reason to believe your father is headed to Silverton," Isaac said after a while. "I'll be leaving at first light tomorrow." Willa set down her spoon. "I see. Well, thank you for the meal and for the other matter, I'll find my way from here." "That's not what I meant," Isaac said, frowning. "Blackburn will still be looking for you. This town isn't safe." "What are you suggesting, Mr. Thornton?" "Isaac," he corrected again. "I'm suggesting you come with me to Silverton." Willa stared at him. "With you, on a bounty hunt for my own father. The alternative is staying here where Blackburn knows exactly where to find you." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm not asking you to help me capture your father, but Silverton is a growing town with opportunities. You could start fresh there." "And what happens when we find my father? Will I watch you drag him to jail, or worse?" Isaac met her gaze steadily. "Your father has stolen from a lot of people, Miss Abernathy. Good people who trusted him. There are consequences for that." "Willa," she said suddenly. "If I'm to call you Isaac, you should call me Willa." He nodded once. "Very well, Willa. The stage coach leaves at 7 tomorrow. I'll purchase your ticket if you decide to come. Either way, I've arranged a room for you tonight." He slid a key across the table. "Room 4 upstairs. I'm in room 7 at the end of the hall if you need anything." Willa picked up the key, examining it. "Why are you doing all this?" Isaac was quiet for a moment. "Let's just say I understand what it's like when family leaves you to face consequences that should have been theirs." Before she could ask what he meant, he stood. "Get some rest. Whatever you decide, I'll respect your choice." As he walked away, Willa realized she was at a crossroads. Stay in a town where she was known as the gambler's daughter who'd been sold at auction, or journey with a bounty hunter toward an uncertain future. Neither choice seemed particularly promising, but at least one offered a path forward. That night, Willa barely slept. The room Isaac had arranged for her was small but clean, with a narrow bed, washstand, and small window overlooking the main street. She spent hours staring at the ceiling, weighing her limited options. By morning, her decision was made. She had nothing but the clothes on her back and her mother's silver locket hidden in her shoe, the one thing she'd managed to keep from the creditors. There was nothing for her in Central City but bad memories and Silas Blackburn's unwanted attention. She was waiting in the lobby when Isaac descended the stairs at 6:30, his saddlebag slung over one shoulder and his rifle case in hand. "You're coming then," he said, no surprise in his voice. "I am," she confirmed, "but I have conditions." One corner of his mouth quirked up. "I'm listening." "I'm not helping you track my father. I won't be used as bait or as a means to gain his trust." Isaac nodded. "Fair enough. And when we reach Silverton, we part ways, no obligations on either side." "Agreed." He shifted his bags. "Anything else?" Willa hesitated. "I need clothing and other necessities." Without a word, Isaac reached into his pocket and withdrew a small pouch, placing it in her hand. "The general store opens at 7. We have time before the stage departs. Get what you need and meet me at the depot." The pouch held more money than Willa had seen in months. She looked up at him suspiciously. "I told you I can't repay this. Consider it an advance against your father's bounty," he said, his expression unreadable. "Now go, I'll secure our passage." The journey from Central City to Silverton would take nearly a week, first by stagecoach to Denver, then by train to Durango, and finally another stage for the last rugged stretch into the San Juan Mountains. Willa spent what little time she had at the general store selecting the essentials: 2 simple dresses, undergarments, a warm shawl, and basic toiletries. The shopkeeper's wife, taking pity on her situation, threw in a pair of sturdy boots at no extra charge. "You'll need these in the mountains, dear," the older woman said kindly. "The ones you're wearing won't last another week." By the time Willa reached the stagecoach depot, Isaac was waiting with their tickets. The stage was already loading a battered Concorde coach that had seen better days, hitched to a team of 6 horses. 5 other passengers were boarding: an elderly couple, a young minister with a nervous disposition, and 2 rough-looking men who appeared to be miners. As Willa approached, she noticed Isaac's posture stiffen slightly. His hand moved to rest casually near his holster as he scanned the street behind her. "What is it?" she asked quietly. "Blackburn's men," he murmured. "Two of them across the street. They've been watching the depot since dawn." Willa resisted the urge to turn and look. "Do you think they'll try something? Not with this many witnesses, but they'll report back to him." He handed her ticket to the driver and helped her into the coach. "We'll need to be careful in Denver. Blackburn has connections there." The interior of the coach was cramped and smelled of leather, tobacco, and too many bodies in close quarters. Willa took a seat by the window with Isaac beside her. The elderly couple sat opposite them, while the minister and the two miners squeezed onto the remaining bench. With a crack of the whip and a lurch forward, the stagecoach began its journey. Willa caught a final glimpse of Central City as they rounded the bend, the place she'd called home for 2 years, now just another town in her past. "Are you all right?" Isaac asked quietly. Willa realized she'd been clutching her small bundle of new possessions so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She forced herself to relax. "Yes," she said, though in truth she wasn't sure. She was leaving behind everything familiar, traveling with a man she barely knew toward a future completely unwritten. "Just thinking about what comes next." Isaac studied her for a moment. "One day at a time," he said simply. "That's all any of us can do." As the stagecoach rattled down the mountain road, Willa found herself watching the bounty hunter more carefully. There was a stillness about him that seemed at odds with his profession. While the two miners talked loudly about their prospects and the minister fidgeted with his Bible, Isaac sat quietly alert, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings through the windows. "Have you been a bounty hunter long?" she asked when the others' conversations had created enough noise for them to speak privately. 5 years, he replied. "Before that, I rode with the Texas Rangers for a while. And before that," a ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Curious, aren't you? I'm traveling with you. Seems reasonable to know something about the man I'm entrusting my safety to." He conceded the point with a slight nod. "I grew up on a cattle ranch near San Antonio, youngest of 3 brothers. And your family?" Something in his expression closed off. "They're gone now." The finality in his tone discouraged further questions about his past. Instead, Willa asked, "How many men have you brought in?" 37, he answered without hesitation. "All alive." She raised her eyebrows. "You don't kill the men you hunt." "I'm not an assassin, Willa. I bring men to face justice, not to their graves." His blue eyes met hers steadily. "Though I will kill if necessary to protect myself or others." The elderly woman across from them had been pretending not to listen, but at this, she clicked her tongue disapprovingly. "Such violent talk in front of a lady," she muttered to her husband. Isaac touched the brim of his hat apologetically. "You're right, madam. My apologies." The first day of travel passed slowly, the coach stopping only briefly to change horses at relay stations along the route. By nightfall, they reached a small way station where travelers could purchase a hot meal and rudimentary sleeping accommodations. The place was little more than a large cabin with separate sleeping quarters for men and women. Willa found herself sharing a room with the elderly woman, Mrs. Patterson, while the men bunked together in a larger room across the hall. "Traveling alone with that bounty hunter," Mrs. Patterson remarked as they prepared for bed. "Not very proper, is it, dear?" Willa had been bracing herself for such comments. "Mr. Thornton is escorting me to relatives in Silverton," she lied smoothly. "After my father's passing, I had little choice but to accept his protection." The lie seemed to satisfy the older woman, who nodded sympathetically. "Well, he seems decent enough, though, that profession." She shook her head. "A handsome young man like that should settle down, find proper work." Willa murmured agreement, though her mind caught on the word handsome. She hadn't allowed herself to think of Isaac in those terms, focusing instead on the practical aspects of their arrangement. But there was no denying his striking appearance, from those penetrating blue eyes to the strong lines of his jaw, softened only slightly by the dark stubble that had appeared over the course of the day. She pushed such thoughts aside. Isaac Thornton was hunting her father. Whatever his reasons for helping her, romantic notions had no place in their relationship. The second day of travel brought them closer to Denver. the terrain gradually flattening as they left the higher mountains behind. The coach hit a particularly deep rut around midday, jolting Willa sideways against Isaac's shoulder. His arm came up automatically to steady her. "Sorry," she said, straightening quickly. "No harm done," he replied, his hand lingering briefly on her arm before withdrawing. The brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through her, which she attributed to simple human connection after days of emotional isolation. By late afternoon, the distant buildings of Denver appeared on the horizon, a sprawling city that dwarfed Central City in both size and sophistication. Willa had visited once with her parents years earlier, but the city had grown significantly since then. "We'll stay overnight," Isaac informed her as the coach approached the outskirts. "The train to Durango leaves tomorrow at noon." When they finally arrived at the Denver depot, Willa's entire body ached from the long hours of travel over rough roads. Isaac helped her down from the coach, his strong hands at her waist momentarily supporting her full weight as her stiff legs adjusted to standing. "Thank you," she said, smoothing her crumpled dress. "I'd forgotten how exhausting stagecoach travel can be." "It doesn't get easier," he said with a slight smile, "but the train will be more comfortable." They bid farewell to their fellow passengers and made their way through Denver's bustling streets toward a modest hotel Isaac knew from previous visits. Unlike the Gibson in Central City, this establishment catered primarily to travelers rather than locals, its lobby filled with people coming and going from the nearby railroad station. Isaac secured 2 rooms adjacent, but with a proper wall between them rather than the flimsy partitions of the way station. As he handed Willa her key, his expression grew serious. "I need to meet with someone tonight," he said in a low voice. "Someone who might have information about your father." "I thought we agreed I wasn't helping with your hunt," Willa reminded him, her tone cooling. "We did, and I'm not asking you to, but I wanted you to know why I'll be out." He glanced around the lobby. "Stay in your room with the door locked. Don't open it for anyone but me, and I'll knock 3 times, pause, then twice more." The gravity in his voice alarmed her. "Are you expecting trouble?" "Always," he replied simply. "Especially in a city where Blackburn has friends. I've arranged for dinner to be sent up to your room in an hour." Before she could protest being confined like a prisoner, Isaac added more gently, "I know you're tired, Willa. Rest tonight. Tomorrow will be another long day." She couldn't argue with that logic. Every muscle in her body cried out for a proper bed and a hot bath. "Very well, but Isaac, be careful." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, at her concern. "Always am," he said, touching the brim of his hat before turning to leave. True to Isaac's word, dinner arrived an hour later, a hearty stew with fresh bread, far better than the meals at the way station. Willa ate by the window, watching as dusk settled over Denver and the gaslights came to life along the streets below. After dinner, she indulged in the luxury of a hot bath, washing away days of dust and worry. As she soaked in the warm water, she found her thoughts returning to Isaac. He remained a puzzle, the hard-edged bounty hunter who nevertheless showed her unexpected kindness. A man who hunted her father but seemed determined to protect her. It was well past midnight when the promised knock came at her door. 3 raps, a pause, then 2 more. Willa, who had been dozing in a chair by the window, started awake and hurried to answer. Isaac stood in the hallway, his expression grim. A darkening bruise marked his left cheekbone and his knuckles were raw. "What happened?" Willa gasped, stepping back to let him enter. "Blackburn's men," he said, closing the door behind him. "2 of them jumped me outside the saloon." "You're hurt." "I'm fine. They look worse." He removed his hat, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "But it confirms what I suspected. Blackburn's put the word out about both of us." "Both of us?" Willa repeated, alarmed. Isaac nodded grimly. $500 for information on your whereabouts, $1,000 if you're delivered to him personally." The room seemed to tilt momentarily. Willa sank into the nearest chair, trying to comprehend why Silas Blackburn would go to such lengths to find her. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why me? I'm nothing to him." Isaac pulled the other chair closer and sat facing her. "It's not about you," he said quietly. "It's about what your father took from him." What are you talking about? Isaac hesitated, as if weighing how much to tell her. Your father didn't just gamble away his money and yours. He convinced Blackburn to invest in a non-existent silver mine, $20,000. Willa felt the blood drain from her face. 20,000, that's impossible. My father never had access to that kind of money. He didn't need it. He only needed to convince Blackburn the investment was real. Isaac's eyes were steady on hers. Blackburn wants your father dead. And he wants you as leverage to draw him out. The implications were staggering. Her father hadn't just been a foolish gambler, he was a thief and a con man on a scale she hadn't imagined possible. And now a dangerous man wanted both of them dead. What do we do? She asked, her voice barely audible. We leave at first light, Isaac replied firmly. Not at noon with the regular train. I've arranged passage on a freight train that departs at 5. It won't be comfortable, but it will get us out of Denver before Blackburn's men realize we've gone. And then we stick to the original plan, to Silverton. He leaned forward, his expression intent. Willa, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. She nodded, bracing herself. Did you know anything about your father's schemes, the fake investments, the cons? No, she answered immediately, then hesitated. I knew he was gambling, I knew he borrowed money, but I thought, she swallowed hard, I thought he was just desperate after my mother died. I never imagined he was deliberately cheating people. Isaac studied her face, seeming to search for any sign of deception. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him because he nodded once. I believe you, he said simply. Those 3 words, spoken with quiet conviction, broke something inside Willa. Tears she'd been holding back for days finally spilled over. I'm sorry, she said, wiping them away quickly. Everything I thought I knew. Without a word, Isaac reached out and covered her hand with his. His palm was warm and calloused against her skin, the touch oddly comforting. Get some rest, he said gently. I'll come for you at 4:30. He rose to leave, but Willa held onto his hand for a moment longer. Thank you, she said, for believing me and for everything else. A shadow of a smile crossed his face. Good night, Willa. The freight train was exactly as Isaac had described, uncomfortable, noisy, and far from the passenger accommodations Willa had expected. They rode in a modified boxcar with several railroad workers and a few other travelers who'd paid for unofficial passage. The car was fitted with crude benches along the walls, leaving most of the space free for cargo, in this case, crates of mining equipment bound for the southern Colorado territories. Despite the early hour and the rough conditions, Willa felt oddly relieved to be moving again. Each mile put more distance between them and Blackburn's men in Denver. Isaac sat beside her, alert despite the pre-dawn departure, his rifle resting across his knees. As the sun rose, painting the eastern plains in gold, Willa studied her companion's profile. The bruise on his cheekbone had darkened overnight, and she noticed now a small cut at his temple that had scabbed over. You should have let me clean those cuts, she said quietly. Isaac glanced at her. They're nothing, I've had worse shaving. Still. She dug into her small bundle of possessions and produced a clean handkerchief. At least let me. With a sigh that suggested more patience than annoyance, Isaac tilted his face toward her. Willa dampened the handkerchief with water from his canteen and gently dabbed at the dried blood on his temple. This isn't necessary, he murmured, but he didn't pull away. Consider it partial repayment for everything you've done, she replied, focusing on her task rather than on how close their faces were or how his eyes seemed even bluer in the morning light. When she finished, she became acutely aware of the railroad workers watching them with poorly disguised interest. She sat back quickly, returning the handkerchief to her bundle. Thank you, Isaac said, something unreadable in his expression. The journey to Durango would take 2 days by rail, much faster than the stagecoach, but still a substantial trek across Colorado's varied terrain. They passed the time in conversation, with Willa gradually drawing out more of Isaac's story. He'd grown up on a cattle ranch, the son of a former soldier turned rancher. His childhood had been shaped by hard work and the relentless Texas sun. At 18, he joined the Rangers, serving for 3 years before circumstances led him to bounty hunting. What circumstances? Willa asked when they stopped for water around midday, stretching their legs beside the tracks. Isaac gazed at the distant mountains. My family lost everything, he said after a long moment. My father was killed over a land dispute. My brothers tried to seek justice through the courts, but the man responsible had too much influence. I'm sorry, Willa said softly. He shrugged, though the set of his shoulders suggested the wound wasn't as healed as he pretended. My brothers headed to California after that. I decided to stay and make sure men like him couldn't escape justice so easily. Is that why you became a bounty hunter, to bring men to justice? Partly, he admitted. And partly because I'm good at tracking, good with a gun, and not much good at anything else. Willa doubted that was true, but she didn't contradict him. And my father, how did you end up tracking him? Isaac hesitated. The judge in Central City put out the bounty, $500 for Gerald Abernathy to be brought back to stand trial for fraud. Just fraud, not for... She couldn't bring herself to say it, for selling his own daughter. The judge didn't mention that particular crime, Isaac said, his voice hardening slightly. But when I find your father, we can add it to his charges. The train whistle blew, signaling it was time to board again. As they climbed back into the boxcar, Willa found herself oddly comforted by Isaac's quiet anger on her behalf. It had been a long time since anyone had been protective of her. The second day of rail travel brought them into increasingly mountainous terrain. The freight train moved more slowly now, laboring up steep grades and navigating sharp turns that followed the contours of the land. By evening, they had reached Durango, a frontier town that had sprung up around the railroad. We'll stay here tonight, Isaac told her as they disembarked. The stage to Silverton leaves in the morning. Unlike Denver, Durango was small enough that Isaac seemed unconcerned about Blackburn's influence reaching them. They secured rooms at a modest hotel near the stage coach office, and for the first time since leaving Central City, Willa felt she could breathe easily. Are you hungry? Isaac asked as they stood in the hotel's narrow hallway between their rooms. Willa realized she was famished. The provisions on the freight train had been minimal jerky, hardtack, and water, shared among all the passengers. Starving, she admitted with a small smile. There's a decent place down the street, not fancy, but the food is good, he paused, unless you'd prefer to rest. Food first, she decided. Then rest. The establishment Isaac led her to was indeed simple, a tavern that served hearty meals to miners, railroad workers, and travelers. They found a table in the corner, away from the more boisterous patrons at the bar. After placing their orders, Willa noticed Isaac scanning the room with his usual vigilance. Do you ever relax? She asked. He looked back at her, one eyebrow raised slightly. What do you mean, you're always watching, looking for threats? She gestured around the tavern. Even here where no one knows us. A faint smile touched his lips. Habit, I suppose. In my line of work, letting your guard down can be fatal. It sounds exhausting, she observed. It can be, he acknowledged, but it keeps me alive. He took a sip of his coffee. What about you, Willa? What kept you alive in Central City after your mother passed? The question caught her off guard. No one had asked about her struggles since her mother's death, not even her father, who had retreated into gambling and schemes. Hope, I suppose, she said after a moment. Hope that things would get better, that my father would. She trailed off, unable to complete the thought now that she knew the full extent of her father's deception. Would be the man you thought he was, Isaac finished for her. She nodded, grateful for his understanding. My mother was the strong one. She held everything together when she got sick last winter. Willa looked down at her hands. Everything fell apart so quickly. Their food arrived: beef stew with dumplings, fresh bread, and apple cobbler for dessert. As they ate, Willa found herself telling Isaac more about her life. About growing up in Missouri, her father's restlessness that led them west after the war, and finally settling in Colorado when Willa was 19. My mother loved the mountains, she said, a wistful smile crossing her face. She said the air made her feel young again. The irony is she only got to enjoy them for a year before the consumption took hold. I'm sorry, Isaac said, and there was genuine empathy in his voice. Losing a parent changes everything. "It does," she agreed softly. "But not always in the ways you expect." They finished their meal in companionable silence, both lost in thoughts of the past. As they walked back to the hotel, the evening air crisp with the scent of pine, Willa realized she felt more at ease with Isaac than she had with anyone since her mother's death. At her door, she turned to face him. "Thank you for dinner," she said, "and for listening." "Thank you for sharing," he replied. In the soft lamplight of the hallway, his features seemed less severe, the usual alertness in his eyes giving way to something warmer. For a brief, startling moment, Willa wondered what it would be like to step closer, to feel his arms around her. The thought came unbidden and was quickly suppressed. Whatever tenuous friendship they had built, she couldn't afford to complicate it with romantic notions. "Good night, Isaac," she said, stepping back slightly. "Good night, Willa. The stage leaves at 9. I'll meet you for breakfast at 8. As she closed the door behind her, Willa leaned against it, her heart beating oddly fast. It would be foolish to develop feelings for a man who was hunting her father, whose entire life revolved around tracking men to justice. Foolish and inevitably heartbreaking. Yet as she prepared for bed, she couldn't quite dismiss the warmth in his blue eyes or the way his hand had felt covering hers. The final leg of their journey proved to be the most challenging. The road from Durango to Silverton wound through the steep San Juan Mountains, following narrow passages that hugged cliffsides and crossed rushing mountain streams. The stagecoach lurched and swayed alarmingly on the rough track, sometimes forcing passengers to lean inward to avoid tipping over the edge. They shared the coach with 3 miners and a young woman traveling to join her husband, a shopkeeper who had established himself in Silverton the previous year. The woman, Mary Fletcher, was visibly nervous about the treacherous road, gasping audibly at every particularly sharp turn. "First time in the mountains, madam?" one of the miners asked sympathetically. "Yes," she admitted, clutching her handbag tightly. "I've never seen anything like this in Ohio." "You'll get used to it," the miner assured her. "Silverton's worth it. Prettiest little town in the mountains, and growing every day." Willa listened with interest. She knew little about Silverton beyond what Isaac had told her, that it was a mining town that had sprung up after silver was discovered in the area, now expanding into a proper settlement. "Have you been to Silverton before?" she asked Isaac quietly. "Twice," he replied. "Brought in a bank robber last year who thought the mountains would hide him, and a deserter from the army the year before that. And now my father," Willa said, more statement than question. Isaac's expression softened slightly. "If he's there," he said, "information is never perfect in this business." Mary Fletcher was watching them with undisguised curiosity. "Are you two headed to Silverton to settle?" she asked hopefully. "It would be nice to have more families in town." "John, my husband, says it's mostly miners and merchants at present." Before Willa could formulate a response, Isaac answered smoothly, "Miss Abernathy has relatives in the area. I'm escorting her safely to them." The same lie they'd used before, but this time it bothered Willa more deeply. Perhaps because Silverton was their final destination, and once there, she would indeed need to find her own way. "Oh, how lovely," Mary replied. "Family is so important in these frontier towns." My John says her words were cut short as the stagecoach hit a particularly deep rut, jolting everyone violently. Mary squealed in alarm, and even the miners looked momentarily concerned. "Road gets worse before it gets better," the driver called back to them. "Hang on tight." Isaac's arm came around Willa's shoulders instinctively, steadying her against the rough passage. She found herself leaning into his solid warmth, grateful for the support as the coach rattled over the uneven ground. When the road finally smoothed again, Isaac's arm remained in place for a moment longer than necessary before he withdrew it. Willa immediately missed its reassuring weight. "Thank you," she murmured. He nodded once, his attention already back on the passing scenery. Though Willa noticed his eyes lingered on her profile when he thought she wasn't looking, by late afternoon, Silverton came into view, a collection of wooden buildings nestled in a valley surrounded by towering mountains. Despite its remote location, the town showed signs of prosperity. New construction was evident on the outskirts, and the main street featured several substantial buildings including a hotel, a bank, and various businesses. "There it is," Isaac said as the stagecoach began its final descent. Silverton. Willa studied the town that would become her new home, at least temporarily. It was larger than she'd expected, though still modest compared to Denver or even Central City. "It's beautiful," she said, gazing at the mountain backdrop that seemed to cradle the settlement. "It can be," Isaac agreed. "It can also be brutal in winter. The pass is close with snow, and the town is cut off except for the most determined travelers." "Is that why my father might have come here, to hide where few would follow?" Isaac considered this. "Possibly. It's also a place where a man with a silver tongue could thrive. New people arriving daily, all hoping to strike it rich. Plenty of opportunity for someone selling dreams." The description stung, despite its accuracy. Her father had always been a seller of dreams. Willa had simply never realized how hollow those dreams were until it was too late. The stagecoach pulled into the depot at the edge of town, where a small crowd waited to greet the new arrivals. Mary Fletcher's reunion with her husband brought tears to Willa's eyes. The pure joy on both their faces as they embraced was a poignant reminder of what real love looked like. "What now?" Willa asked as she and Isaac collected their meager belongings. "Hotel first," he decided. "Then I'll make some inquiries around town. Your father would have arrived at least a week ago, if my information is correct." They secured rooms at the Silver Peak Hotel, the largest establishment in town. Unlike their previous accommodations, this was a relatively new building, constructed to attract a better class of visitor than the typical miner or drifter. The lobby featured polished wooden floors, a small sitting area with comfortable chairs, and a front desk staffed by a young man in a crisp white shirt. As Isaac signed the register, Willa became aware of curious glances from other guests. A woman traveling with a man who was clearly not her husband still raised eyebrows, even in a frontier town. "Perhaps we should continue the story that you're escorting me to relatives," she suggested quietly as they climbed the stairs to their rooms. To avoid gossip, Isaac nodded. "Sensible. Though in a town this size, people will talk regardless." Their rooms were adjacent again, comfortable if not luxurious. Willa's featured a double bed, a washstand with a porcelain basin, a small writing desk, and a window that overlooked the main street. After days of travel, the prospect of a proper bed and a hot bath seemed like the height of luxury. "I'll go out and ask around," Isaac told her once they'd settled in. "See if anyone recognizes your father's description." "I should come with you," Willa said. "I know his face better than anyone." Isaac hesitated. "If he's here and he sees you?" "He'll run," Willa finished. "I know, but he might run anyway if he sees you asking about him." She squared her shoulders. "Besides, I've been cooped up in coaches and trains for days. I'd like to see the town that might become my home." After a moment's consideration, Isaac nodded. "All right, but if we find any trace of him, you stay back. I don't want you caught in the middle if things go badly." The thought of a confrontation between Isaac and her father sent a chill through Willa. Despite everything, Gerald Abernathy was still her father. The idea of seeing him arrested or worse was deeply troubling. As if reading her thoughts, Isaac added more gently, "I'll bring him in alive, Willa. You have my word." She met his gaze, searching for reassurance. "And then what? Prison?" "That's for the judge to decide," he said carefully. "But yes, likely prison. What he did especially to you wasn't just immoral, it was criminal." Willa nodded, accepting the truth of his words even as she struggled with the emotions they evoked. "Let me change first," she said, "then we can go." Silverton bustled with activity despite the late hour. Miners fresh from their shifts crowded the saloons, merchants were closing up shops, and wagons laden with ore rumbled through the streets toward the smelting works on the edge of town. Isaac led Willa methodically from one establishment to another, starting with the saloons where information flowed as freely as whiskey. At each stop, he described Gerald Abernathy tall, silver-haired, well-spoken, likely presenting himself as a businessman or investor, and watched reactions carefully. By their fourth saloon, Willa was beginning to lose hope. No one seemed to recognize the description, or if they did, they weren't admitting it. Maybe he never came to Silverton after all, she suggested as they paused outside a particularly rowdy establishment called the Lucky Strike. Maybe, Isaac conceded, but my information is usually reliable. Let's try one more place. The Lucky Strike was the largest saloon in town, occupying a prime corner location on the main street. Inside, a long bar ran along one wall, tables filled the center space, and a small stage at the back featured a piano player thumping out a lively tune. The clientele was a mix of miners, businessmen, and a few well-dressed women who were clearly employed by the establishment. Isaac guided Willa to a table in the corner, positioning her so her back was to the wall and she had a clear view of the entire room. It was the kind of tactical awareness she'd come to expect from him. "Stay here," he instructed. "I'll speak to the barkeeper." As he made his way to the bar, Willa observed the room carefully. Most of the patrons were too engrossed in their drinks, games, or companions to pay her much attention, though she noticed a few curious glances. A respectable woman in a saloon, even one as relatively upscale as the Lucky Strike, was an unusual sight. Her eyes were drawn to a table near the back where 4 men played cards. 3 were obviously miners, still dusty from their day's work. The 4th was better dressed, a dark suit, freshly shaven, with silver hair that caught the lamplight. Willa's heart seemed to stop. Even from across the room, she recognized her father's profile, the way he held his cards, the gesture he made when placing a bet. For a moment, she considered calling out to Isaac, who was still engaged in conversation with the barkeeper. But something held her back. Perhaps it was the fear of a public confrontation, or perhaps it was the simple human desire to understand why had he abandoned her, why had he chosen this path, why had he fallen so far from the man she'd once admired. Without fully considering the consequences, Willa rose from her table and made her way toward the card game. Her father was so focused on his hand that he didn't notice her approach until she was standing directly behind one of the miners. "Hello, father," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. Gerald Abernathy's head snapped up, his expression transforming from concentration to shock in an instant. The cards slipped from his fingers, scattering across the table. "Willa," he gasped, his face draining of color. What are you doing here?" The miners at the table looked between father and daughter with undisguised interest. "Is this your girl, Abernathy?" one of them asked. "You never mentioned family." Gerald ignored him, rising slowly from his chair. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and urgent. "How did you find me?" "That would be my doing," came Isaac's voice from behind her. Willa hadn't heard him approach, but suddenly he was there, his presence solid and reassuring at her back. Gerald's eyes darted to Isaac, widening in recognition. "Thornton," he breathed, "the bounty hunter." His gaze returned to Willa, accusation flashing in his eyes. "You're working with him, against your own father." The unfairness of the accusation stung. "Working with him," Willa repeated incredulously. "After you sold me to pay your debts, after you left me to be auctioned like cattle." The miners exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly realizing they were witnessing a family drama they wanted no part of. One by one, they gathered their money and cards and retreated to other tables. Gerald's expression hardened. "You don't understand. I was coming back for you." "I just needed time to raise the money enough," Isaac cut in, his voice cold. "Gerald Abernathy, there's a warrant for your arrest in Central City for fraud and theft. You're coming with me." Gerald's hand moved toward his jacket, but Isaac was faster. His gun appeared as if by magic, aimed steadily at Gerald's chest. "Don't," Isaac warned quietly. The saloon had gone silent, all eyes on the confrontation unfolding in the back corner. The piano player had stopped mid-tune, and the barkeeper was watching warily, one hand presumably on a shotgun beneath the bar. "Please," Willa said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't make this worse." Something in her father's face changed, the mask of confidence slipping to reveal a glimpse of the desperate man beneath. For a brief moment, Willa saw what he had become. A shell of the man she'd once known, hollow and running on nothing but schemes and self-deception. You don't know what you're doing, girl, Gerald said, his voice harsh. This man doesn't care about you, he's only using you to get to me. Before Willa could respond, the saloon doors burst open with a bang. 3 men entered, guns already drawn. Willa recognized one immediately: Silas Blackburn's right-hand man from Central City. Thornton, the man shouted. Mr. Blackburn sends his regards. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Isaac shoved Willa to the floor as gunfire erupted. Patrons screamed and dove for cover. Gerald, seeing his opportunity, lunged for the back door. Willa, her ears ringing from the shots, saw her father's escape and made a split-second decision. She scrambled to her feet and raced after him, ignoring Isaac's shout of her name. The back door led to a narrow alley between the saloon and the neighboring building. Ahead, she could see her father running toward the street at the far end. Despite his age, he moved with surprising speed. "Father, wait," she called, giving chase. To her surprise, he slowed, turning to face her with an expression of mingled fear and anger. "Go back, Willa," he ordered. "This isn't your fight." "Not my fight," she repeated, closing the distance between them. "You made it my fight when you offered me as collateral, when you left me to be sold." More gunshots echoed from inside the saloon. Gerald glanced nervously toward the sound. "There's no time for this. Blackburn's men will kill us both." "Then come back with Isaac," she urged. "Face the consequences properly. It's your only chance." Gerald's laugh was hollow. "Face the consequences." "I'll hang, girl, or rot in prison. Is that what you want for your father?" "I want the man who raised me," Willa said, her voice breaking. "The man who taught me to ride, who read to me at night, who promised to protect me. What happened to him?" Something flickered in Gerald's eyes, regret, perhaps, or simply calculation. He took a step toward her. "I can still be that man. Come with me now. We'll go west to California, start fresh where no one knows us." For the briefest moment, Willa wavered. Despite everything, the pull of family, of the familiar, was strong. But then she remembered standing on that auction platform, remembered the look in Blackburn's eyes as he bid on her, remembered Isaac's hand untying her bonds and his quiet promise of freedom. "No," she said firmly. "I'm done running, done hiding, done pretending. And if you were truly the man I thought you were, you would be too." Gerald's face hardened. "Then you've made your choice." He turned to go, then paused, looking back at her one last time. "For what it's worth, I am sorry, Willa. I never meant for you to get hurt." Before she could respond, more gunshots rang out, closer this time, accompanied by the sound of breaking glass. Gerald flinched, then disappeared around the corner into the gathering darkness. Willa stood frozen in the alley, torn between chasing after her father and returning to help Isaac. The decision was made for her when someone grabbed her arm from behind. She whirled, ready to fight, only to find Isaac, a bleeding cut across his forehead but otherwise intact. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his eyes scanning her for injuries. "No, I'm fine, but my father, I saw him," Isaac confirmed grimly. "But we have bigger problems right now. Blackburn's men are still inside and they've called for reinforcements." "How did they find us?" Willa asked, bewildered. "Blackburn has connections everywhere. Someone in Denver must have recognized us and sent word ahead." He took her hand. "We need to get off the streets, now." They moved quickly through back alleys, avoiding the main thoroughfares where Blackburn's men might be searching for them. The commotion at the Lucky Strike had drawn attention. They could hear the town marshal's whistle and shouts as they made their way circuitously back toward the hotel. "We can't go back there," Isaac said as they paused in the shadow of a livery stable. "It's the first place they'll look." "Then where?" Willa asked, the reality of their situation finally sinking in. They were being hunted in a town where they had no allies, no sanctuary. Isaac was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing their limited options. "There's a place up in the hills," he said finally. "A cabin belonging to an old trapper I helped once. He told me I could use it if I ever needed to lie low." "How far?" "About 3 miles. Rough terrain, but defensible." He looked at her with concern. "It won't be comfortable." Willa almost laughed at the understatement. "Comfort is the least of my worries right now." Something like admiration flickered in Isaac's eyes. "We'll need supplies, food, blankets, and I need to clean up." He touched the cut on his forehead, his fingers coming away bloody. The general store might still be open, Willa suggested. I could go while you stay out of sight. They won't be looking for a woman alone. Isaac shook his head firmly. Too dangerous, we stay together. Isaac, she said reasonably, you're bleeding and armed. You'll draw attention immediately. I can slip in, buy what we need, and be out in minutes. He hesitated, clearly torn between pragmatism and his instinct to protect her. I'll be careful, she promised. Meet me behind the store in 15 minutes. After another moment's consideration, Isaac reluctantly agreed. Take this, he said, pressing several coins into her palm. Get only what we need. And Willa, his eyes met hers, intense and worried. If you see any sign of trouble, any at all, leave immediately. Your safety matters more than supplies. The simple declaration warmed her despite their dire circumstances. I'll be careful, she repeated softly. The general store was indeed still open, though the proprietor was clearly preparing to close for the night. Willa entered with a friendly smile, quickly selecting basic provisions: jerky, beans, coffee, hardtack, matches. She added a roll of bandages and a small bottle of antiseptic for Isaac's wound, along with a blanket and 2 tin cups. The shopkeeper, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, watched curiously as she assembled her purchases. Planning a trip, miss? My brother and I are meeting friends for a hunting expedition tomorrow, she improvised. Just getting the last few supplies, he nodded, apparently accepting her explanation. As he tallied her purchases, the bell over the door jingled. Willa tensed, but it was only a young boy, perhaps 12 or 13, coming to deliver a message. Mr. Foster, the boy said breathlessly, the marshal says there's trouble at the Lucky Strike. Gunfight broke out. He's looking for witnesses, anyone who was there. The shopkeeper, Mr. Foster, looked alarmed. Gunfight? Was anyone hurt? Don't know yet. But they're saying Silas Blackburn's men from Central City are involved, and maybe a bounty hunter too. Willa kept her expression neutral with effort, focusing on counting out her payment as the conversation continued. The marshal's stopping people in the streets, the boy added. Asking if they've seen a man and woman traveling together, tall fellow with blue eyes and a woman with brown hair. Mr. Foster's gaze shifted to Willa, suddenly more appraising. She felt a chill run down her spine but maintained her composure. Thank you for the information, Tommy, Foster said to the boy. Tell the marshal I haven't seen anyone matching that description. The boy nodded and darted back out the door. Foster turned his attention back to Willa, who had finished gathering her purchases into a bundle. Sounds like excitement in town tonight, she commented lightly. I should get back to my brother before he worries. Foster studied her for a long moment. Miss, he said quietly, there's a back door through the storeroom, might be less crowded that way. Willa's heart raced. Had he recognized her? Was he trying to help or trap her? That's very kind of you, she said cautiously. I mind my own business, Foster continued, his voice still low. And I believe others should be allowed to do the same without interference from men like Blackburn. Relief flooded through her. Thank you, she said sincerely. Foster nodded once, then led her through to the storeroom and unlocked the back door. Good luck to you, he said simply before returning to his counter. Isaac was waiting in the shadows as arranged, his posture tense with worry. His expression relaxed fractionally when he spotted her. Any trouble? He asked as she handed him the supplies. The marshal is looking for us, she informed him. Questioning people in the streets, but the shopkeeper helped me slip out the back. Isaac looked surprised. That was fortunate. I think there are more good people in the world than you give credit for, Willa suggested. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Perhaps. Let's hope we don't need to test that theory further tonight. They made their way out of town as quietly as possible, keeping to the shadows and avoiding the main roads. Once beyond the outskirts, they followed a narrow trail that wound up into the forested hills surrounding Silverton. The path grew steeper and more difficult as they climbed. Willa, exhausted from the day's events and the stress of their escape, stumbled more than once on the uneven ground. Each time, Isaac's steady hand caught her elbow, supporting her without comment. Not much farther, he assured her after nearly an hour of climbing. Just over this ridge. The cabin, when they finally reached it, was little more than a one-room shelter, 4 walls of rough-hewn logs. a slanted roof, and a stone chimney. It stood in a small clearing, surrounded by pines and with a view of the valley below, where Silverton's lights twinkled in the distance. Inside was sparse but functional. A small iron stove, a rough table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed frame with a straw mattress, and shelves holding basic supplies left by the trapper. It smelled of pine resin and wood smoke, not unpleasant but distinctly rustic. "It's not much," Isaac said apologetically as he lit the oil lamp hanging from a ceiling beam. "It's perfect," Willa replied honestly. After the day's events, any safe haven seemed like luxury. Isaac built a small fire in the stove while Willa organized their supplies. The warmth slowly filled the cabin, welcome against the mountain chill that had descended with nightfall. "Let me see that cut," Willa said when they had settled somewhat. Isaac sat in one of the wooden chairs while she dampened a cloth with water from the cabin's supply and the antiseptic she'd purchased. "It's nothing," he protested, but submitted to her ministrations nonetheless. "It doesn't look like nothing," she countered, gently cleaning the dried blood from his forehead. The cut was longer than she'd initially thought, running from his temple into his hairline. "This might need stitches." "It'll heal," he said dismissively. "I've had worse." Willa frowned but didn't argue. She finished cleaning the wound and applied a bandage as best she could. Throughout her work, Isaac remained perfectly still, his blue eyes watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. When she finished, their faces were inches apart. Willa suddenly became acutely aware of their isolation, of the intimate setting, of how her hand still rested lightly on his shoulder. "Thank you," Isaac said softly, his voice deeper than usual. Willa stepped back quickly, busying herself with putting away the medical supplies. "You should rest," she said, her own voice slightly unsteady. "I can take first watch if you're worried about Blackburn's men finding us." "They won't look for us in the hills tonight," Isaac said confidently. "Too dark, too dangerous, but I'll take first watch anyway. You need sleep more than I do." She wanted to argue but found she couldn't. Exhaustion was settling into her bones, making her limbs feel heavy and her thoughts sluggish. "The bed is yours," Isaac continued, nodding toward the narrow frame against the far wall. "I'll be comfortable enough in the chair." Willa glanced at the bed dubiously. It was little more than a cot, really, with a threadbare blanket that looked inadequate against the mountain chill. "We can take turns," she suggested. "I'll sleep for a few hours, then you can." Isaac didn't argue, which she took as agreement. She added the blanket she'd purchased to the one already on the bed and lay down fully clothed, too tired to worry about propriety or comfort. Despite her exhaustion, sleep didn't come immediately. Her mind raced with the day's events, the confrontation with her father, the gunfight at the saloon, their narrow escape. And beneath it all, the growing awareness of her feelings for Isaac. It was foolish, she knew. They had known each other only days. Their association had been born of necessity, not choice. And yet, she couldn't deny the connection that had formed between them, forged in danger and strengthened by each hardship they faced together. She watched through half-closed eyes as Isaac moved quietly around the cabin, checking the windows, ensuring the door was secure, arranging his weapons within easy reach. Every movement spoke of competence and care. When he finally settled into the chair, his rifle across his knees and his face illuminated by the soft glow of the dying fire, Willa thought he looked like a guardian angel from one of her mother's old stories, fierce and watchful, beautiful and dangerous. With that comforting image, she finally drifted into sleep. Willa woke to sunlight streaming through the cabin's single window and the smell of coffee brewing on the stove. For a moment she was disoriented, the unfamiliar surroundings confusing her sleep-fogged mind. Then the previous day's events rushed back and she sat up quickly. Isaac stood by the stove, his back to her as he tended the small fire. He'd removed his coat and rolled up his shirt sleeves, revealing forearms corded with muscle. "You were supposed to wake me," she said, her voice still rough from sleep. "You need rest too." He turned, a faint smile touching his lips. "Good morning to you too." Willa pushed the blankets aside and rose, smoothing her crumpled dress as best she could. "Did you sleep at all?" An hour or two, he admitted. I'm used to it. He poured coffee into the 2 tin cups Willa had purchased and handed one to her. The bitter brew was strong and hot, exactly what she needed to clear the last cobwebs from her mind. What now? She asked after taking a fortifying sip. Isaac moved to the window, looking out over the valley. We have options, he said thoughtfully. None of them perfect. Tell me, she insisted. We could stay here a few days, wait for things to calm down in town. Or we could try to make it to the next settlement. Our array is about 20 miles south. Or, he hesitated, she prompted, or I could go back alone, finish what I started. Your father is still in Silverton. I'd stake my reputation on it. Willa set down her cup. And what about me? Hide in this cabin while you risk your life. You'd be safe here, he said reasonably. And once I've dealt with Blackburn's men and brought in your father, I could come back for you. No, Willa said firmly. I'm not hiding while you face danger on my behalf. We're in this together now. Isaac turned to look at her fully, something unreadable in his expression. Together, he repeated softly. Then, with more determination, all right, but we need a plan. Charging back into town without one would be suicide. They spent the morning strategizing over the remnants of their supplies. Isaac knew Silverton well enough to sketch a rough map of the town, marking the locations of importance: the marshal's office, the hotel, the saloons where Blackburn's men might be lurking. Your father will be lying low, Isaac reasoned, but he won't leave town yet. Not with Blackburn's men watching the roads and his business unfinished. What business? Willa asked. Isaac hesitated, then seemed to decide she deserved the full truth. From what I learned last night, your father has been setting up another scheme here. Convincing local businessmen to invest in a non-existent mining operation. Willa's heart sank. So nothing's changed. He's still running the same cons. People rarely change their patterns, Isaac said gently, especially when they've been successful. She couldn't argue with that assessment, painful as it was. So where would he go? Where would he feel safe? Isaac considered this. He's a gambler. He'd go somewhere he controls the odds. He tapped his crude map. There's a private gaming room above the Diamond Back Saloon. Invitation only, high stakes. If your father has established himself here, that's where he'd retreat to familiar ground. Then that's where we'll find him, Willa said decisively. Isaac shook his head. It's not that simple. We need to deal with Blackburn's men first. As long as they're hunting us, we can't move freely in town. How many are there? At least 3 that I saw, possibly more by now. His expression darkened. Blackburn doesn't do anything by half measures, Willa thought for a moment. What if we used that against him? If his men are looking for us, we could lead them away from town, somewhere we have the advantage. A slow smile spread across Isaac's face, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his features, making him look younger, almost boyish. That's not bad, he acknowledged. Draw them out, deal with them away from witnesses and innocent bystanders. And then we return for my father, Willa finished. Isaac studied her with newfound appreciation. You know, for someone who's never been on the wrong side of the law, you have a surprisingly tactical mind. I grew up reading penny dreadfuls, she admitted with a small smile, and my mother always said I had more sense than sentiment. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. She was, Willa agreed softly. They spent the rest of the morning refining their plan. Isaac would go into town alone, making himself visible enough to be noticed by Blackburn's men. He would then lead them on a chase out of town, toward a location he knew well, an abandoned mining camp about a mile north of Silverton. The old structures will provide cover, he explained. And I know every approach. They'll be at a disadvantage. And me? Willa asked, already anticipating his answer. You stay here where it's safe. She shook her head firmly. No, I'm coming with you. Isaac's expression hardened. Willa, these men are killers. This isn't a game or one of your penny dreadfuls. If something went wrong, if something goes wrong, you might need help, she countered. Besides, they're looking for us together. One man alone might not be enough bait. He looked as though he wanted to argue further, but must have recognized the determination in her face. You stay hidden, he finally conceded. No unnecessary risks, and you follow my lead exactly. Agreed, she said, trying not to show her satisfaction too openly. They left the cabin shortly after midday, descending the trail back towards Silverton. Isaac had cleaned his weapons meticulously that morning, his rifle and 2 revolvers, and now moved with the focused concentration of a man preparing for battle. Willa found herself watching him with a mixture of admiration and concern. In just a few days, this man had risked his life for her multiple times, had shown her kindness when she needed it most, and had treated her with a respect few others had afforded her. And now he was preparing to face down killers on her behalf once again. "Isaac," she said as they paused on a ridge overlooking the town, "I never properly thanked you for everything." He glanced at her, seeming genuinely surprised. "You don't need to thank me." "I do," she insisted. "You could have collected your bounty and left me to my fate. Instead, you've put yourself in danger repeatedly for my sake." Isaac was quiet for a long moment, his gaze returning to the town below. "I've spent 5 years bringing men to justice," he finally said. "Some deserved it more than others." "But your father," he shook his head slightly, "what he did to you crossed a line I can't ignore, no decent man could." "Is that the only reason?" Willa asked, her heart beating faster. "Decency?" His eyes met hers, blue and intense in the midday sun. "No," he admitted softly. "Not the only reason." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken feelings. Then Isaac straightened, his expression becoming professional once more. "We should keep moving," he said. "I want to reach the mining camp before sunset to prepare." Willa nodded, both relieved and disappointed by the shift in focus. There would be time later, she told herself. After Blackburn's men were dealt with, after her father was brought to justice, after the immediate dangers were past, if they survived what was coming. The abandoned mining camp sat in a small valley north of Silverton, a collection of weathered structures that told the story of boom and bust so common in these mountains. A collapsing headframe marked the entrance to the played-out mine, while scattered around it stood the remains of the operation, a crumbling assay office, bunkhouses with missing walls, and a stable that still retained most of its roof. "This is perfect," Isaac said as they surveyed the area from a ridgeline. "Plenty of cover, multiple firing positions, and only 2 main approaches." Willa tried to see the camp through his tactical eyes. "Where do you want me?" "The assay office," he decided after a moment's consideration. "It still has most of its walls, and there's a window facing the main approach. You'll have cover and visibility. And you, I'll move between positions, keep them guessing where I am." He handed her one of his revolvers. "Do you know how to use this?" "My father taught me the basics when we first moved west," she said, taking the weapon carefully. "Though I've never fired at a person." Isaac's expression was grim. "With luck, you won't have to, but if it comes to it, don't hesitate. These men won't show mercy because you're a woman." They spent the next hour preparing the camp, identifying the best positions and creating crude alarms, tin cans strung on twine across likely approaches that would rattle if disturbed. By the time they finished, the sun was beginning to dip toward the western mountains. "I'll go into town now," Isaac said, checking his remaining weapons one last time. "Make myself visible, then head back here. They should follow within an hour." Willa nodded, trying to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. "Be careful." Isaac hesitated, then stepped closer to her. Before she realized his intent, he had cupped her face gently in one hand, his calloused palm warm against her cheek. "If anything happens to me," he said quietly, "don't wait. Head south toward our array. Find the marshal there, Jim Harker. Tell him Isaac Thornton sent you. He'll help you." Willa's throat tightened with fear and other, more complicated emotions. "Nothing will happen to you," she insisted. "You'll come back." A small smile touched his lips. "Yes, madam, I will, just being cautious." For a moment she thought he might kiss her. His gaze dropped briefly to her mouth and she felt herself leaning slightly toward him. But then he stepped back, the moment passing. "I'll be back before dark," he promised, then turned and disappeared down the trail toward town. Willa watched until she could no longer see him, then retreated to her assigned position in the assay office. The building's interior was dusty and cluttered with abandoned equipment, but it offered good visibility of the main trail leading from town. As she waited, the light gradually faded, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Willa found herself praying something she hadn't done since her mother's death for Isaac's safe return, for strength to face whatever came next, for wisdom to know what to do with her father when they finally confronted him. The sun had just disappeared behind the western peaks when she heard the first distant hoofbeats. Willa tensed, gripping Isaac's revolver more tightly as she peered through the broken window. A single rider appeared on the trail first Isaac, pushing his horse hard. Behind him, at a distance of perhaps 100 yards, came 3 riders in pursuit, Blackburn's men, just as they'd expected. Willa's heart pounded as she watched Isaac dismount at the edge of the camp, slapping his horse to send it running past the buildings. He then disappeared into the shadows between structures, moving to his first planned position. The pursuing riders slowed as they approached the abandoned camp, clearly wary of a trap. They stopped just beyond the perimeter, conferring briefly before splitting up, one heading straight up the main path while the others circled to approach from different directions. The trap was sprung. Willa steadied her breathing, focusing on the rider approaching her position. He moved cautiously, gun drawn, scanning the buildings. When he passed one of their trip wires, the rattling cans made him jerk his weapon toward the sound exactly as they'd planned. At that moment, a shot rang out from across the camp. One of the other riders cried out in pain. The man nearest Willa whirled toward the sound, momentarily forgetting to watch his own surroundings. Willa aimed carefully, remembering Isaac's instructions. She fired not at the man himself, but at the ground near his horse. The animal reared in panic, throwing its rider to the ground. More gunshots echoed through the camp, Isaac engaging the third rider. Willa kept her focus on the fallen man, who was struggling to his feet, cursing viciously. He spotted her in the window and raised his gun. Willa ducked as his shot splintered the wood beside her head. Heart racing, she changed position, moving to another window on the opposite side of the building. From there, she saw Isaac locked in a gunfight with the third rider, both men using abandoned mining equipment for cover. The man Willa had unseated was approaching her building now, moving in a crouch from cover to cover. She waited, remembering the layout of the assay office, calculating his likely entry point. When the door creaked open, she was ready. As soon as he stepped inside, she swung a heavy piece of mining equipment, an old assay scale that she'd positioned earlier. It caught him squarely in the chest, knocking him backward. His gun clattered to the floor as he fell. Willa kicked the weapon away and trained her revolver on him. "Don't move," she ordered, her voice steadier than she felt. The man glared up at her, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. "You bitch," he spat. "Blackburn's gonna skin you alive when he finds you." "Blackburn isn't here," Willa replied coldly, "and you're in no position to make threats." Outside, the gunfire had ceased. Willa's stomach clenched with fear for Isaac. Was he injured? Or worse? She didn't dare take her eyes off her prisoner to check, but her question was answered moments later when Isaac appeared in the doorway, his rifle trained on the fallen man. "You all right?" He asked Willa, his eyes quickly scanning her for injuries. "I'm fine," she assured him. "The others, one wounded, one dead," Isaac reported grimly. "They didn't leave me much choice." He moved into the building, producing a length of rope from his pocket. With efficient movements, he bound the man's hands behind his back. "Harley Jenkins," he said, recognition in his voice. "Still doing Blackburn's dirty work, I see." The man Jenkins glowered silently. "Where's Blackburn?" Isaac demanded. "Go to hell, Thornton." Isaac sighed, then delivered a sharp blow to Jenkins' jaw that rendered him unconscious. "He'll be more talkative when he wakes up," he said to Willa. "But we don't have time to wait." "What do we do with him?" she asked, looking at the unconscious man with distaste. "Leave him secured." "We'll send the marshal out for him after we're done in town." Isaac studied her face. "You did well. That was quick thinking with the assay scale." "I was more afraid of hitting him too hard and killing him," she admitted. I wouldn't want that on my conscience." Isaac's expression softened. "That's because you're a good person, Willa, better than most in this line of work." Something in his tone made her look at him more closely. There was a new tension in his posture, a slight stiffness in his movements. "You're hurt," she realized suddenly. He shook his head dismissively. "Grazed my side, nothing serious." Let me see, she insisted. After a moment's hesitation, Isaac lifted his coat and shirt to reveal a bloody furrow across his ribs. The bullet had indeed only grazed him, but the wound was still bleeding freely. Sit down, Willa ordered, pointing to a relatively intact chair in the corner. I'll clean it. Using water from Isaac's canteen and strips torn from her petticoat, she cleaned the wound as best she could. Isaac watched her work, his expression unreadable in the fading light. We should get back to town, he said when she'd finished bandaging his side. Your father will be moving soon, especially when Blackburn's men don't return. Willa nodded, though concern lingered. Can you ride? I've ridden with worse, he assured her, rising to his feet with only a slight grimace. They secured Jenkins thoroughly, then retrieved Isaac's horse, which had returned to graze nearby after its initial flight. With Willa riding behind Isaac, they made their way back toward Silverton as true darkness fell over the mountains. The town was quieter now, most businesses closed except for the saloons, which glowed with lamplight and echoed with music and laughter. Isaac tethered his horse at a hitching post several blocks from the Diamond Back, their ultimate destination. Remember the plan, he said quietly as they walked through the shadows. We locate your father, I make the arrest. You stay back unless absolutely necessary. Willa nodded, though her heart was racing at the thought of the coming confrontation. Despite everything her father had done, the prospect of seeing him arrested or worse, seeing him resist and possibly be harmed filled her with dread. The Diamond Back was one of the more upscale establishments in Silverton, catering to businessmen and the occasional wealthy miner rather than the rougher elements. A burly man stood guard at the entrance, eyeing them suspiciously as they approached. Private establishment, he growled. Members only. Isaac produced a small leather wallet and removed several bills. We're here for the game upstairs, he said smoothly. Mr. Abernathy is expecting us. The doorman's eyes narrowed, but the money disappeared into his pocket. Up the stairs, first door on the right. Knock twice, then once. Inside, the saloon was elegantly appointed with polished wood, brass fixtures, and red velvet upholstery. A small orchestra played in one corner, and well-dressed women circulated among the patrons, offering drinks and companionship. Isaac led Willa toward the stairs at the back, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. To anyone watching, they might have appeared to be a couple out for an evening's entertainment, rather than a bounty hunter and his reluctant companion about to confront a wanted man. At the top of the stairs, Isaac paused, drawing Willa into the shadows of the hallway. Wait here, he murmured. If anything goes wrong, if you hear gunfire, get out immediately. Don't wait for me. Willa shook her head. I'm coming with you. Willa, he's my father, she said firmly. I need to see this through. After a moment's consideration, Isaac nodded reluctantly. Stay behind me, and be prepared he may not come quietly. They approached the door as instructed, and Isaac knocked twice, then once. After a brief pause, the door opened a crack, revealing a thin-faced man with spectacles who examined them carefully before stepping back to admit them. The room beyond was cloudy with cigar smoke, dimly lit by shaded lamps that cast pools of light on a large central table where 6 men sat playing cards. Stacks of money and chips crowded the green felt, along with half-empty glasses of whiskey and brandy. Gerald Abernathy sat at the far end of the table, his back to the wall, a gambler's instinct to never leave his back exposed. He was dressed in an expensive suit, his silver hair neatly combed, looking for all the world like a successful businessman rather than a con man on the run. His eyes widened when he saw Willa and Isaac in the doorway. What the Gerald Abernathy, Isaac said clearly, his hand moving to rest on his holstered gun. I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of fraud, theft, and endangerment. You're coming with me to face justice in Central City. The other players at the table reacted with varying degrees of alarm and confusion. 2 immediately rose and backed away from the table, clearly wanting no part in whatever was unfolding. The others remained seated, watching with wary interest. Thornton, Gerald said, recovering his composure. And my dear daughter, what an unexpected surprise. His gaze shifted to the other men at the table. Gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption. This bounty hunter seems to have confused me with someone else. There's no confusion, Isaac replied steadily, and no need for anyone to get hurt. Come quietly, Abernathy. Gerald's expression hardened. I've done nothing wrong. These gentlemen will vouch for my character. We're business partners in a very promising mining venture. One of the men at the table frowned. What's he talking about, Abernathy? What charges? Fraud, Isaac repeated, selling shares in non-existent mines, running confidence schemes across 3 territories, his voice lowered, and selling his own daughter to pay his debts. A shocked murmur ran through the room. The man who had spoken looked at Gerald with dawning suspicion, then at the stack of money before him on the table. Is this true? He demanded. Gerald's hand moved slightly and Isaac tensed. Don't, he warned quietly. For a tense moment, Willa thought her father might draw the weapon she knew he carried concealed in his jacket. Then, surprisingly, he laughed a hollow sound devoid of humor. It seems my past has caught up with me, he said, raising his hands slightly to show he wasn't reaching for a weapon. But before I go anywhere, I'd like a moment alone with my daughter. Isaac shook his head. Not happening. Please, Gerald said, an unfamiliar note of sincerity in his voice. 1 minute, that's all I ask. Willa stepped forward before Isaac could refuse again. It's all right, she said quietly. 1 minute. After a moment's hesitation, Isaac nodded reluctantly. 1 minute, he agreed. The rest of you gentlemen clear the room. The remaining card players needed no further encouragement. They gathered their money and belongings, filing out quickly. Isaac followed them to the door but remained inside, his back to the wall where he could watch both Gerald and the entrance. Well, daughter, Gerald said when they were as alone as they were going to get, you've certainly chosen an interesting companion. I didn't choose any of this, Willa replied, her voice tight with emotion. You did that when you gambled away everything we had, when you abandoned me. Gerald had the grace to look ashamed, if only briefly. I had a plan, Willa. I always have a plan. And how many of your plans have actually worked? She asked bitterly. How many have left me picking up the pieces while you moved on to the next scheme? Her father sighed, suddenly looking older than his years. I know I've failed you, failed your mother too, God rest her soul. He glanced at Isaac, then back to Willa. But I had my reasons. What reasons could possibly justify what you did? Willa demanded. Your mother's medical bills, Gerald said quietly. They were more than I let on, much more. The ranch was mortgaged to pay for her care, her medicine. When she died anyway, he shook his head. I was drowning in debt, Willa. Desperate men make desperate choices. Willa felt as though the floor had tilted beneath her. Why didn't you tell me you were grieving? I wanted to protect you, to solve the problem myself. A bitter smile crossed his face, and we see how well that turned out. Isaac's voice cut through the moment. Time's up. Gerald nodded, rising slowly from his chair. One last thing, Willa, he said, reaching into his jacket. Isaac's gun appeared instantly. Hands where I can see them, he ordered sharply. Easy, Thornton, Gerald said, carefully withdrawing a folded document. Just some papers for my daughter. He held them out to Willa, who took them cautiously. What is this? She asked. Deed to a small claim outside of Silverton, Gerald replied. It's legitimate, one of the few honest investments I've made. Not worth much now, but there's silver there. Could be valuable someday. Willa stared at the papers in disbelief. Why would you give this to me? Because despite my many failings, you're still my daughter. Gerald's eyes held a sincerity she hadn't seen in years. And because I owe you far more than I can ever repay. Before Willa could respond, Isaac stepped forward, handcuffs ready. It's time to go, Abernathy. To her surprise, her father submitted without protest, allowing Isaac to secure his wrists. As they prepared to leave, Gerald looked at Willa one last time. The bounty hunter, he said quietly. He's a good man, better than me, certainly. With that, Isaac led him from the room, Willa following behind, her mind still reeling from her father's revelations and his unexpected gift. The trip to the marshal's office was mercifully uneventful. The town had largely quieted for the night, with only the occasional drunk or late-night reveler on the streets. The marshal, a grizzled older man named Taggart, was initially suspicious of Isaac's credentials, but accepted the warrant after careful examination. Blackburn's men. Taggart asked as he locked Gerald in one of the 2 cells in the small jailhouse. 3 of them at the abandoned mine camp north of town, Isaac replied. 1 dead, 1 wounded, 1 tied up. They ambushed us earlier today, the marshal sighed heavily. I'll send deputies out at first light. He eyed Gerald through the bars. This one worth all that trouble? $500, Isaac confirmed, plus expenses for bringing him in from Silverton to Central City. Gerald watched this exchange with resigned detachment, his earlier emotions seemingly spent. When Willa approached the cell, he looked up with tired eyes. Was any of it true? She asked quietly. About Mother's medical bills, every word, he replied, though it doesn't excuse what came after. Willa nodded, accepting this partial redemption of her father's character. What will happen to him? She asked Isaac as they left the jailhouse. He'll stand trial in Central City, Isaac replied. With his confession and the evidence against him, he'll likely serve 5 to 10 years. And you'll take him back there, Isaac nodded. That's the job. I'll leave with him on tomorrow's stage. The words hit Willa with unexpected force. Of course he would leave, that had always been the plan. Isaac was a bounty hunter, Gerald was his bounty. Once delivered, he would move on to the next job, the next chase. That was his life, and it wasn't hers. They walked in silence back to the hotel, the reality of their imminent separation hanging between them like an invisible barrier. At the door to her room, Willa paused, unable to let him go without saying what was in her heart. Isaac, she began, then faltered, uncertain how to continue. He stood before her, his blue eyes shadowed with emotions she couldn't quite read. Willa, he said softly, her name almost a caress on his lips. Thank you, she managed finally. For everything. I don't know what would have happened to me if you hadn't been there that day in Central City. You would have found a way, he said with surprising conviction. You're stronger than you know, Willa shook her head. I wasn't then, but perhaps I am now. She took a deep breath. What happens after tomorrow? Where will you go? Isaac hesitated, his gaze dropping briefly before meeting hers again. Wherever the next bounty takes me, I suppose. Always moving on, she said, unable to keep a hint of sadness from her voice. Always alone. It's the life I chose, he replied, though something in his tone suggested doubt. Willa gathered her courage. What if you chose something else? The question hung between them, loaded with implication. Isaac's expression softened, and he took a half-step closer to her. Willa, he said, his voice deeper than usual. I'm not the kind of man who can offer stability. My life is dangerous, unpredictable. You deserve better than that. Shouldn't I be the one to decide what I deserve? She countered. These past days with you have been the most frightening of my life and also the most alive I've ever felt. Isaac's hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch gentle despite the calluses on his palm. You could have been killed because of me, or I could have been sold to Blackburn without you, she reminded him. Life offers no guarantees, Isaac, not for any of us. He was silent for a long moment, his thumb tracing a gentle path along her cheekbone. Then, with a softness that belied his strength, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was tentative at first, a question rather than a demand. Willa answered by stepping closer, her hands coming to rest on his chest as she returned the pressure. His arm slid around her waist, drawing her against him as the kiss deepened, becoming something more urgent, more honest than words could express. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Isaac rested his forehead against hers. I've wanted to do that since the first day, he confessed quietly. Why didn't you? She asked, her heart racing with newfound joy. A small smile touched his lips. Because I'm not in the habit of kissing women I've just rescued from auction blocks. Despite the gravity of their situation, Willa laughed softly. A commendable restraint. Isaac's expression grew serious again. Willa, I can't stay in Silverton. I have to take your father back to Central City. I know, she said, her own smile fading. And I wouldn't ask you not to. He needs to face the consequences of his actions. After that, he hesitated, as if weighing his next words carefully. After that, I was thinking I might retire from bounty hunting. Hope blossomed in Willa's chest. Oh. 5 years is a long time to live with a gun on your hip and one eye always watching your back, he said. I've saved most of my earnings, enough to start something new, something more settled. What kind of something? Willa asked, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. Isaac's eyes met hers, earnest and clear. That would depend on whether I'd be starting it alone. The implication was unmistakable. Willa's breath caught in her throat. Isaac Thornton, are you asking what I think you're asking? I'm asking if you'd consider waiting for me, he said simply. I'll be gone 3 weeks, maybe a month. When I return, if you still feel the same. He took a deep breath. I'd like to court you properly. No bounties, no danger. Just a man and a woman seeing if they might build a life together. Tears pricked at Willa's eyes, tears of happiness she hadn't expected to feel again after all she'd lost. I would like that very much, she whispered. Relief and joy transformed Isaac's face, making him look younger, unburdened. He kissed her again, more confidently this time, his arms holding her securely against him as if he never wanted to let her go. When they parted, Willa remembered the deed her father had given her. I have a mining claim, she said with a small smile. Perhaps that's where we could start. Isaac laughed softly. A bounty hunter and a gambler's daughter turning to honest mining. The Lord does work in mysterious ways. He brought you to that auction, Willa reminded him, and now here we are. Here we are, Isaac agreed, wonder in his voice, and here we'll be again when I return. I'll be waiting, Willa promised. True to his word, Isaac departed the next morning with Gerald Abernathy in custody. Their farewell was brief but heartfelt, with promises exchanged and one last kiss to sustain them through the weeks of separation. As Willa watched the stagecoach disappear down the mountain road, she felt a curious mix of emotions: sadness at the parting, concern for both Isaac and her father on their journey, but beneath it all, a steady current of hope that had been absent from her life for too long. The weeks of Isaac's absence passed more quickly than Willa had expected. She used her time to establish herself in Silverton, taking a position as an assistant at the town's small library and renting a modest room from a widow named Mrs. Hollister. In her free hours, she visited her mining claim, discovering it was indeed legitimate, if undeveloped. By the time 4 weeks had passed, Willa had created the beginnings of a life in Silverton, not just marking time until Isaac's return, but laying foundations for whatever future might unfold. She had acquaintances, if not yet friends, work that suited her love of books and knowledge, and a growing appreciation for the beauty of the mountain town. Still, each day ended with her eyes turning eastward, wondering how far Isaac had traveled and when he might return. It was on a crisp autumn afternoon, with golden aspen leaves swirling in the mountain breeze, that Willa emerged from the library to find a familiar figure waiting across the street. Isaac stood beside his horse, watching for her, his face lighting up when their eyes met. Propriety forgotten, Willa rushed across the street and into his arms. He lifted her off her feet in an embrace that spoke of longing finally fulfilled, of promises kept, of a future newly possible. You came back, she said when he finally set her down, though he kept his arms around her waist. I told you I would, he replied, his blue eyes warm with affection. How was the journey? Is my father? She trailed off, uncertain how to finish the question. He's serving his sentence, Isaac assured her. 5 years with possibility of early release for good behavior. The judge was lenient, considering the circumstances. Relief flooded through Willa. Her father would face justice, but not excessively harsh punishment. It was, perhaps, the best outcome she could have hoped for. And you? She asked, searching Isaac's face. Are you truly finished with bounty hunting? A smile spread slowly across his features. I am. Turned in my commission, collected my final payment. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch, and I bought something on the way back. Willa's breath caught as he opened the pouch and tipped a simple gold ring into his palm. It wasn't ornate or flashy, just a slender band with a small, perfect diamond that caught the afternoon sunlight. I know this is fast, Isaac said, suddenly looking uncharacteristically nervous. We've only known each other a short time. If you need more time to be sure, Willa silenced him with a finger against his lips. Isaac Thornton, when a man saves you from an auction block, faces down killers on your behalf, and crosses mountains to return to you. I'd say that's enough time to know what's in his heart. Relief and joy washed over his face. He took her hand in his, the ring held ready. Willa Abernathy, will you marry me, build a life with me here in Silverton, or wherever the future takes us? Yes, she said simply, her heart too full for elaborate declarations. With all my heart, yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then sealed their engagement with a kiss that promised a lifetime of adventures yet to come, not the dangerous kind they'd survived together, but the everyday adventures of building a home, a family, a shared future. They were married 2 weeks later in Silverton's small church, with Mrs. Hollister and the librarian as witnesses. The ceremony was simple, the celebration modest, but the joy that filled both their hearts needed no elaborate expression. That night, in the small cabin they'd rented near Willa's mining claim, Isaac held his new wife close as they talked of the future. "I've been thinking about the claim," he said, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "If the silver's there like your father believed, we could hire men to work it properly, build something lasting. And if it's not?" Willa asked, genuinely curious rather than concerned. Isaac smiled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Then we'll find another way. I'm good with my hands handy with tools. There's always work for a man willing to do it. And I can continue at the library," Willa added. "Mrs. Peterson mentioned they might need a full-time librarian soon when she retires." "Books and silver," Isaac mused, "an unusual combination." "No more unusual than a bounty hunter and a gambler's daughter," Willa reminded him with a smile. "We're writing our own story now." 2 years later, on a summer evening much like the one when they'd first met, Willa sat on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching as Isaac played with their infant son in the yard. The mining claim had indeed proved valuable, though not spectacularly so enough to provide them with comfort and security, but not the kind of wealth that changed a person's character. Isaac had used his share of the profits to start a small carpentry business, crafting furniture for Silverton's growing population. Willa divided her time between motherhood and her position as the town's librarian, finding fulfillment in both roles. As twilight settled over the mountains, Isaac carried their sleepy son up to the porch, settling beside Willa on the swing he'd built the previous summer. "He's getting heavy," Isaac commented, looking down at the dark-haired boy drowsing against his chest. "Growing strong like his mother." Willa leaned against her husband's shoulder, contentment washing over her. "I received a letter today," she said after a moment, "from my father." Isaac's arm tightened slightly around her. "Good news or bad? Good, I think. He's being released early next month." "Good behavior, just as you predicted." She hesitated. "He asked if he might visit to meet his grandson." Isaac was quiet for a moment, considering. Their relationship with Gerald had been complicated, letters exchanged, forgiveness offered gradually, but always with the awareness of past wounds not fully healed. "What do you think?" he asked finally. "It's your decision, Willa," she smiled at his deference to her judgment. "I think family is precious even when flawed, and everyone deserves a second chance." She looked up at him. "You gave me mine that day in Central City." Isaac pressed a kiss to her temple. "You never needed a second chance, Willa. You just needed someone to see your worth." As the stars began to appear above the mountains, Willa reflected on the strange, winding path that had led her to this moment of perfect contentment. From the auction block in Central City to the porch of her own home, with a man who had risked everything to save her and a child who represented their shared future. "You know," she said softly, "when you said you're coming with me instead that day, I never imagined where the journey would lead." Isaac smiled, the same smile that had first warmed her heart 2 years ago. "The best journeys are the ones we take together," he said, "and ours is just beginning." In the gentle mountain twilight, surrounded by the life they'd built together, Willa knew with absolute certainty that he was right. Their story, born in danger and desperation, forged through trials and trust, had only just begun. And whatever chapters lay ahead, they would face them as they had faced everything else, together with courage and with love.